in an ongoing process of hybridization, implying in-between spaces that are created and inhabited by hybrids. Of course, here in the context of Arab American identity, I'm just appropriating Homi Bhabha's findings and especially his discourse on hybridity. For instead of discussing the encounter between the culture of the colonizer and the culture of the colonized, here within the context of Arab American identity and Arab American subjectivity, we rather speak of the encounter between the culture of origin, or the culture of homeland, and the culture of host country, that is Arabness and Americanness. So in this encounter between Arab and American cultures, what happens? We expect the values and the characteristics of both cultures to meet, intersect, result in complementarity, conflict, repulsion, antagonism. That's why when we are talking about this encounter, we also have in mind the notion, again, of Homi Bhabha's third space. Bhabha speaks of an in-between space that he calls the third space of enunciation, which allows for the building of new cultural formations. Trapped between two cultures or two spaces, the individual finds possibilities of wholeness and harmony in a new space, a third space where two cultures, two languages, two sets of values interact and collude. Hayyan Sharara, who is a contemporary Arab American poet, thinker, and critic, also borrows from Bhabha to highlight doubleness as the delineating aspect that marks Arab American identity. He explains that the space occupied by many Arab Americans is definitely a third space, I quote, one that is here and there, as well as neither here or there. When he says it is both here and there, it means that for some Arab Americans, they feel that they are at the same time Arab and American. They embrace both cultures, both subjectivities. But sometimes they feel that they are not Arab, not completely American, so neither here nor there. And the result would be more like an aporia of belonging, would be anxiety, feeling displacement, alienation, and etc. Some other critics, and I mentioned Muhammad Saleh Amri, associate the notion of the third space with diaspora, is still suggesting intersections and encounters between two divergent cultures. I quote, diaspora is a third space where both home and host cultures converge, intersect, and even clash. So we are still with the restlessness of identity, with this anxiety over belonging. So who am I? Arab American, both. Gregory Orfalea, a contemporary Arab American poet, pinpoints that, I quote, Arab Americans live the oddest double life of any ethnic group, since they keep displaying radical disavowals and radical assertions of a heritage and everything in between. This constant movement back and forth is decidedly reflected in the literature. For Arab American writers, the condition of hybridity is continuously rendered in the writing. If you look at the titles and publications of contemporary Arab American books, we are going to see the reflection of this sense of double consciousness and in-betweenness that characterize the present age. Some examples, for example, West of the Jordan by Layla Halabi, Ismaili Eclipse by Khalid Matawa, Za'ta Diva by Suhair Hamad, Cairo House by Samia Sirajuddin, Bint Arab by Ivrin Shahir, Arabian Jais and Crescent by Jana Abu Jaber, etc. There are actually advantages for this doubleness. There is on the one hand the ability to see more clearly the workings of each culture, being the insider and outsider at the same time, and on the other the benefit of relishing the richness of both. But this doubleness is not always an asset. Actually, it generally comes with a price. In the introduction to a contemporary Arab American literature, transnational reconfigurations of citizenship and belonging, Carol Fadda writes, I quote, both terms, Arab and American, are reductive and conceal the complexity of identities, subjectivities, histories, and politics they entail. She believes that doubleness results more in tension than complementarity. A tension which is not based on some epistemic or originary difference between the two entities, but is largely based on history and politics, including colonial histories and neo-imperial US ambitions. In the end, there are two major consequences of living in half a nation. One is rewarding, the other is less so. Living in the interstices of Arab Americanness, writers continue to grapple with the complexities of cultural identity and the pressing need to affirm truncated roots as distinctive but complementary parts of a more negotiable definition of identity. Khaled Matawa actually stands as a very eloquent and very important illustrative example of cultural hybridity as far as Arab American literature is concerned. During an interview broadcasted on Radio Jawhara FM in Sus on June 4, 2010, Matawa was asked, "Who are you when we read you? Are you the Libyan, the Muslim, or the American?" To which the poet answered that he is all of these together, that he is a, quote, a hybrid who belongs to and inhabits both cultures, the Arab and the American. He admits that he is still attached to his homeland with its history, traditions, and values, but in the end that he affirms human values and that he thinks that they should remain universal. Now, more than 30 years in the United States today, Khaled Matawa tries to present himself or identify himself, I quote from his poem Heart Song, "I am the Bedouin pondering the abandoned campsite, licking the ashes of the night fire. The American walking miles of dresses, blouses, and skirts, filling them with infinite lovers, the mystic feeling the pull swirling in his chest." Addressing Matawa in an interview, Salah Hassan started his question thus: "You are a poet versed in Arab culture, but you are also American. You write in English. You reside in this gray zone between two cultures. What does doubleness mean to you?" And Matawa replies, "I am sensitive to both and can deal with both with the same easiness. They are both familiar to me, but sometimes I feel I am alienated in both. This double feeling of familiarity and alienation is continuous." I told you that I'm going to skip a lot. I actually prefer to share with you some poems where I think Khaled Matawa tries to give us an idea of this cultural hybridity thing. One of the representative poems for me is one entitled Date, Palm, Trinity. The poem comprises 3 sections, a very long narrative poem. It is taken from Ismaili Eclipse, his first collection. Each section portrays the given setting of time and place, characters, and a great deal of play on the real and fictional, from a mixing of scenes from real life and others based on dreams. Now, from the outset, if you look at the title, hybridity is already suggested. It juxtaposes opposite cultural signifiers. We have a Trinity, which directly refers to Christianity, and date palm, which evokes Islam. Trinity is also meant to highlight the poem's structure, made up of 3 parts. Based on the images and tropes used, the 3 parts can be said to represent 3 identifications for Matawa. First, his Arab side, second, his American side, and third, his Arab American side. How much time do I still have so that I...
6 minutes.
Okay. The first section of the poem opens with a sad image of pruned date palms. There is emphasis on a disheartening and dejected image of palms cut by an American who stood tall, a pensive pioneer. The image intimates a reduction of bounty, a termination of fertility, which is harsh and aggressive. To accentuate this abject image, the poet uses a series of similes and metaphors that heighten the sense of regretful abruptfulness, pitiful severance, and ensuing strangeness. I quote from the poem, "The top of each palm looked like the back of a man's head after a close-cropped haircut. The neck cooled to a stubbly remembrance of hair, and you, had you wished to console, are greeted with a bowing gaze." Directly then we have the rubble of bark and palms. They remind the speaker of Iraq and Libya and their palms. In both recollections there is juxtaposition of happy images with helpless ones. So in the first there is exalted laudation, the 16 million date palms, 1 per capita, lining the seams of the Tigris and Euphrates, and imminent regret at Iraq's ruined bridges and the surrounding soldiers' hands begging food. In the second, there is boastful glorification of the poet's own Libya and its 10 million date palms, and a slight disappointment at the years, I quote, of easy wealth that brought them neglect. But except in Hun, which is a place in Libya, the poet says, a magical city where they stuffed dates with almonds and sent them as far as Fanta and Durman. In the poem's second section, the poet switches place and time, and he brings us to the world of Whitman. Actually, he meets Whitman in a dream. He accompanies him to a supermarket. The poet relates how he found the poet, I quote, under one of the palms on Sherman Way. Compassionate towards the American poet who had, I quote, seen palms by the Gulf of Mexico, but never tasted a date. Matawa emphasizes Whitman's longing for a taste of, I quote, Araby's sugary dust clouds. Introducing him to frozen foods and the foods labeled free, the poet catches Whitman's craving for candies with which he filled pockets like a child. Both poets fall quickly into a sad silence after that and seem too distant. Like in the first section, there is disappointment or a bitterness sought to be camouflaged or surpassed with longing for sweetness. Whitman, I quote, was shocked by the headlines of our news, Matawa directly says. By the Arab-American poet who engages in a listing of different races and ethnic groups and their noisy worlds in a vivid celebration of diversity, I quote, blacks and now my neighbors, the foreign-born, Hispanics and their engines roaring through, Balboa, Setiko and the Koreans karaoke, the bass lines, muffled thuds, voices dusting Canadian mist, quickly brings him back his America. America remained to him luminous, industrial, fuming, sublime, and as he wished, beyond others' adjectives, beyond what anyone could have conceived. I'm going to quickly give you a peek into another poem which is entitled, and then I conclude very quickly, another poem titled The Blooming Foods Promise, which gives us an example of cultural hybridity again. In this poem, Matawa uses culinary, gustatory, and olfactory imagery to illustrate hybridity in its most explicit way. The food mentioned includes both Oriental items and also typically American food. There are Moroccan olives, Chinese tofu, Japanese norimaki, Indian frozen foods, Tunisian couscous, Lebanese falafel. And besides the eggless mayonnaise, which is obviously a Western product, there are regionally distant products, Boston lettuce. Oriental food includes falafel, tabbouleh, lentil soup. Now for Natalie Handel, the speakers move from Moroccan olives crispy with sand to falafel mix and jars of eggless mayonnaise and details that continue endlessly becomes almost like an obsession, not to forget or miss anything. A way, according to her, to camouflage the painful reality of exile. Perhaps we can read this also as the poet's fretful desire not to let go of any piece of experience or cultural facet which is likely to further broaden his consciousness. This diversity, in fact, illustrates cultural awareness, and food becomes a way to celebrate a pluralistic America. So, bliss can be enjoyed if one knows how to deal with the desperate experiences offered by two seemingly divergent cultures, the Arab and the American. Matawa recognizes cultural hybridity and emphasizes the benefits of cross-cultural experience. He calls for looking at the positive side of taking from more than one culture. Well, I think the answer, if you want not to live in denial, is to recognize the continuities within the sensibilities and experiences of your single subjectivity. What you are given is a set of disparate experiences, fair enough, but there are times when they come together, and it's up to you. Do you want to be a big boy and recognize them and pull them together, or do you want to allow yourself to be impacted by only one set of experiences and deny others? In just one last illustration, in Ismailia Eclipse, there is one poem which testifies to this hybridity. The poem is entitled History of My Face. In it is the first poem ever, in the first collection ever by Matawa. He traces his origins to different countries and histories. African lips, Greek eyebrows, Turkish nose, Roman hair, and Muslim eyelashes. The incessant pull between Arabness and Americanness testifies to the difficulty of providing homogeneous vision of an identity that comprises possibly contentious elements. The encounter between Arabness and Americanness can sometimes give way to hybridity as a site of fusion, interaction, and merger. For Arab-American poets, the most salient manifestations of hybridity are cultural. Matawa stands out as one strong example of cultural hybridity through his experience as a Libyan-American scholar and translator, and mainly as a poet. While he can celebrate the rewards of being both here and there, that is at once Arab and American, what Matawa principally seeks is to foreground humanness, the right to be considered first and foremost human, away from assumptions about ethnicity, requirements of loyalty to Arab culture and or American culture, and conformism to essentialist views of identity. But of course we end with questions. Does embracing hybrid identity shield one from the threats of bifurcation and anxiety? Is global identity within reach for those who live in diaspora? Is celebrating global identity the nearest way to feel and experience wholeness? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bennani, for this enlightening presentation. We will open the floor for both panels, the previous panel and this one. So I would like to ask the audience to ask very, very brief questions, and please avoid making longer comments. So the floor is yours. Khalil.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
So I want to ask